All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, here to shine a light on the mysterious murky waters that we are seeing here in South Africa in the realm of politics. A lot of things that are in need of making sense of. In Afrikaans, we say on the Politiek podcast, to ontnonsens, to de-nonsense. And that's what we're going to be shining the light on today. And that particular topic is opposition in the Government of National Unity era, the GNU. Now, this is a concept or an idea that's the GNU is an idea that's already familiar to many of my South African listeners. But to some of my listeners abroad, you might have just quickly heard about it in passing. I don't think it's occupying your minds on a daily basis, or your conversations on politics on a daily basis, as it is in South Africa, seeing as it is these new uncharted waters. And that's why, because it's these uncharted waters that we are moving in politically, I've actually done a previous episode with Kanthan Pillay to discuss the balance of forces within the GNU era, trying to make sense, as I said, to shine a light here in this arena of politics. And tonight we're going to be continuing that theme with the opposition in the Government of National Unity era as a topic. And joining me here tonight for that particular topic is David Ansara. He is the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, definitely not an organization that my audience is unfamiliar with. I've had his colleague Martin van Staden on as well to discuss many of the ideas that I think are ideas that are shared between my organization, AfriForum, and the Free Market Foundation. There's a lot of cross-pollination there. So welcome on the show, David. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope we have a productive discussion that actually helps people, as I said, to de-nonsense this particular topic that we're going to be tackling tonight.
Yeah, well, great to be on the show, Ans. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues at AfriForum do. So yeah, always good to chat with you. And I'm prepared for a lot of de-nonsensing tonight. So let's get into it.
All right. So I think just to start off, I mean, I've spoken enough already as the intro for our audience members that are abroad, not particularly and that are not particularly aware about what this Government of National Unity is. If I were to give you the challenge of to elevate a pitch what this means or what this GNU is to someone that's not a South African, how would you sum it up as simply as possible?
Well, I guess you could call it various things. You could call it a broad coalition, I think is probably something that a lot of foreign listeners would be familiar with, in the sense of that we've sometimes seen in places like Germany, for example, where you might have the Social Democrats and the Christian Conservatives coming together to form a kind of a big tent government. But really, I think it's something a lot deeper than that. And essentially what we've had throughout South African history is a tale of two kind of competing nationalisms. And the last 3 decades has seen, throughout the democratic era, a period of what we would call ANC hegemony, where you have one single party, what political scientists would call a single party dominant system. So you have a free and open contestation for political power, but one party is the hegemon, the kind of the main political actor. And in the South African case, what we've seen is that dominance has slowly been whittled away. And Ernest Hemingway once wrote, and some of the characters in his book say, well, how did you go bankrupt? Well, slowly and then suddenly. So how did the ANC lose its electoral majority? Similar way. It was kind of death by 1,000 cuts. But I think what we have very interestingly is for those not familiar, the ANC went from 57% in 57.5% in 2019, the last general election, and then on the 29th of May 2024, they recorded 40%. So there was over 17 percentage points decline. The Liberal opposition, the Democratic Alliance, they were kind of in the early 20s. I think it was 22 or so, 23%. And so together they have, through a protracted negotiation process, about 2 weeks, develop this government of national unity, which is really unprecedented. You have this kind of once dominant majority party coming together with its erstwhile opponents, the Democratic Alliance, which has a long history as an opposition party, but also a track record in government at the provincial and local level. And really I think what makes this so interesting to observe is that you have these competing political traditions coming together and different ideological foundations. And we're sort of melding those together. And what comes out is something a bit new and unique. I think for an organization like ours, the Free Market Foundation, we're a non-profit, independent entity. We're a policy group, an advocacy group. So our mandate is very clear. We want to defend and advance the principles of individual freedom, of private property rights. We want a society that's underpinned by the rule of law. We have a small government rather than a big bloated state that interferes in the lives and livelihoods of individuals. And we want, as the name suggests, a free market. We want commerce and the profit motive to be the big driver of economic activity, and free and consenting individuals in an open market with light touch regulation, as we've seen around the world, has produced a lot of goods, a lot of good outcomes. So when we were observing this process, we were saying, okay, well, what actually do we want as an independent civil society group, because we're non-partisan? And I think one of the big concerns here is that we have now a very big bloated government. We have over 70 members in the cabinet, including deputy ministers. And we now have this kind of melting pot of all these different political fiefdoms kind of coming together. And I think what is somewhat concerning as well is that we're not really seeing a big shift in the policy framework, and we can maybe talk about that a bit later in the conversation.
There's been a shift. There's been a shift in the vibes. There's been a shift in the overall feeling. But you're absolutely correct. We've not really seen very significant policy reforms, and I mean your colleague Martin is pointing that out on a daily basis almost.
Yeah. So I think, for those watching abroad, there's been this wave of like relief and euphoria, and it's seen as this kind of patriotic moment, right? That here you have these former foes putting aside their differences and coming together, a weakened ANC and a kind of resurgent DA, but it's not just those parties as well. We've got other parties, the IFP, Gayton McKenzie's Patriotic Alliance, there's the Freedom Front Plus, they have some portfolios as well. So there are a number of other entities, but I think what guided the negotiation process was this principle of sufficient consensus, that if the two major parties could agree, then that was sufficient to kind of move the process along. But, we have seen, and it's been about 100 days now, some, new brooms sweeping clean in key ministries like Home Affairs, for example. Leon Schreiber has removed some backlogs in terms of ID documents and, processing of those. We've seen, some interesting developments in the telecom space. Solly Malatsi is the minister there, and seeming to sidestep BEE regulations in order to facilitate the entry of Starlink into South Africa. I think that's still ongoing, a long way to go, but some interesting signs. But ultimately what we need to see in South Africa is really a fundamental change in the policy framework at the national level. And if you look at what are the big handbrakes in terms of South Africa's economic growth, the labor policy framework that has resulted in millions of people being locked out of the labor market. So the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the National Minimum Wage Act, the Labor Relations Act, these all favor the embedded interests within the tripartite alliance of the ANC and its partners in the Communist Party and the trade unions, which benefits the employed at the expense of the unemployed. That's their constituency, and they're very explicit about serving that constituency, unionized workers. Industrial policy is still very statist. We have a lot of highly interventionist policies around industrial protections. BEE is still being enforced throughout various areas of both state and governance in terms of public procurement, but then also in the private sector in terms of race-based hiring practices and so on. And look, I mean, to give the GNU the benefit of the doubt, it is still fairly early days. But I think what's also quite difficult is that previously a lot of the political contestation happened within the open arena of Parliament, where you could see the debates playing themselves out. But now I think the locus of decision-making has now retreated behind closed doors into the cabinet rooms, and is not happening in the National Assembly in the full view of the public. And so often what's happening is there's like a kind of a black box where decisions are being made and compromises are being made and specific choices are being implemented, but we as the public are we only find out sort of at the end of that process. And I think that's quite damaging to the democratic principle of transparency, which I think is very important.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up as well, David, is the fact that, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about the nature of opposition in the GNU era, because what we've seen now is the absorption of the traditional opposition parties that used to fill the opposition benches, most of them either center-left or centrist. I don't really think the closest to a conservative or a party on the right would probably be the Freedom Front Plus, but they are the farthest I would classify them as probably center-right. But all of these parties and the IFP are certainly also in that ballpark. But they've now been absorbed into the government, many of them given, as you said, ministerial positions. And what we are left now is that there was a void created in the opposition benches, a void that's now just being filled or being fought over by the two main factions or the two main parties, the Umkhonto we-Sizwe or the MK party and the Economic Freedom Fighters or the EFF, both radical revolutionary parties, not parties that promise a lot of stability or any type of a favorable environment for investment or for minority communities if they were to ever gain power. That is the nature of the opposition benches, the de jure or the parliamentary reality when it comes to the opposition. But at the same time, I don't think that means that opposition in the GNU era is completely within the confines of the government. You're completely correct that now a lot of it is happening behind closed doors. And I think you and me have no illusions about the fighting that's going on that we might not know about. So if only we could be a fly on the wall to witness some of those debates. But at the same time, there is an opportunity here from what I can see, and that is a more prominent role for civil society organizations, community-based organizations to play. And you and me both represent such organizations. Do you agree with that hypothesis?
Yeah, look, nature abhors a vacuum, and something will always fill that vacuum. And I think, it's a bit of a trite thing to say that South Africa has a strong civil society, but it is actually true. I mean, I think it's, across the ideological spectrum, you have many organizations not only contributing to the policy debate, but also actually filling the void left by the retreating state as well. Because
there are actually, as the ANC talks about the balance of forces, but these organizations are actually players within the balance of forces. We've seen civil society organizations exercise their power on the government. And sorry to interrupt you there. I just wanted to make that point where when it comes to that idea of South Africa having a civil society, you only have to contrast us to a country like Zimbabwe, to see what happens when you don't have any semblance of a civil society. Then you have a government that pretty much can just run roughshod. That's one of the points that Flip Base actually makes in his book, that South Africa is quite a different animal when it comes to the balance of power, the balance of forces, when you compare it to a country like Zimbabwe, where there was nothing of the sort when it comes to a civil society that can actually challenge the government toe to toe.
Yeah, and I think civil society is a very important part of that ecosystem, and as a bulwark to defend freedom, liberty against potential encroachments on individual freedom. I mean, the media plays a role as well. The courts also very necessary, and often you will see civil society actors like AfriForum, like the Free Market Foundation's Rule of Law Project, engaging in public interest litigation in order to protect specific interests and to uphold specific principles as well, like the rule of law, for example. But yeah, I think we shouldn't be complacent either. I think many of these organizations are chronically underfunded. I think there's often issues around retention of personnel, for example, and I think it's also, these organizations really stand often on the shoulders of others, right? Whether it's a community coming together to provide resources or other kinds of support. Like if I think of the Free Market Foundation, we're quite a small core team in terms of the permanent staff that work here, but we actually have quite a wide network of writers, lawyers, specialists who we draw on an ongoing basis, right? So we couldn't do this work without that kind of support, and if I think of AfriForum and its fairly decentralized model, I mean, you have chapters all over the country, providing security services, providing other support like filling potholes and other activities. So in that sense, I think civil society creates a framework or a structure within which other individuals can operate, and that actually helps to diffuse power throughout society and acts as a very important check against state power or other actors that may want to abuse their power. So we shouldn't take that for granted, and we should defend it vigorously.
And I mean, I'm one of the first people to say that the battle of ideas is important, but it's also not it's not by far the only arena or primary arena even to bring about change. But I mean, there's another element as well, as within the GNU environment, within this context of, I mean, it would be hard to deny that there's not an incentive to now create as much harmony as possible, as much unity as possible, to preserve the vibes, to put it very bluntly. Within that environment, there's not a very strong incentive to be a critic, to be a spoiler, to be someone that's seen as a destabilizer now, that's threatening the harmony, threatening the unity. But I mean, what do you do when you know you're right? What do you do when you are up against, for example, a situation where some on the one side want to preserve the harmony and the unity, but that leads to the passing of destructive laws, but at the same time, you can't just sit back and let it happen for the sake of the vibes. And I think in that type of scenario, which very likely could play out under the GNU, that's particularly also where civil society organizations that are not loyal to any political party are actually have a very strong and a very important role to play, to be the angel on the shoulder, to be the voice of criticism and reason, sometimes of frank truths, despite the threat that it might hold to quote unquote unity and harmony. As long as you know you're right, as long as you know that your arguments are sound and that you are actually taking on policies or ideas that could have very ruinous or disastrous effects.
Yeah, and look, politicians are responding to their own set of incentives, right? They're in the game of pursuing power, of appeasing their constituents, whereas I think civil society organizations like ours perhaps have a bit more freedom. We can attach ourselves to a specific cause or set of ideas and articulate the benefits of those without necessarily having to garner votes at the ballot box, which I think is very important. But yeah, I think your point that civil society acts as a watchman. My Latin is not very good, but there's that saying, "Case custodet ipsos custodet," which is who will watch the watchman, and you need that check and that balance. And I think a very good example of this was the business group Sakelicha, which I know you're familiar with.
Yes,
And
yes, another one of the players on this chessboard on the civil society side.
yes, yeah. And, their focus is on business, and one of their key public policy preoccupations is around BEE and the negative effect that this has in terms of capital allocation, in terms of employment, in terms of competition and the economy. And, I think very importantly, last week, they wrote a letter to Minister John Steenhuisen, who's the leader of the DA, but also the Minister of Agriculture, and to point out, his department has now promulgated regulations that essentially impose BEE criteria on agricultural tariffs, which would mean that there'd be preferential treatment to black-owned farmers who are seeking to export their goods, essentially imposing a penalty on non-compliant entities, non-compliant farmers. That is a good example of, okay, well, you have an established civil service within these former ANC ministries, which is often the product of cadre deployment of, there's very little separation between party and state traditionally and under the ANC's model of governance. And so now you have the previous ministers developed these race-based proposals and is, tempted to drive them through, but then there's this lag effect, and they're still now being implemented. And so Sakelicha quite rightly is saying, okay, well, please could you clarify this, and giving the ministry an opportunity to resolve this problem, and they're not throwing their toys out of the cart, they're not frothing at the mouth, they're just submitting a polite request for clarification, and that is a part of the political process. Politics ultimately does involve competing interests, and that does involve conflict. And I think what the GNU is probably going to struggle with is it can't be everything to all people. The state of South Africa at the moment requires very difficult trade-offs and concessions to be made, and that means there are going to be some people who benefit from that and some people who lose out from that. We've had situations where for many decades we've had dysfunctional state-owned enterprises where the people who work there, the entity might be running into the ground, but they're still getting their paycheck. We need to look at the example of Javier Milei in Argentina, where in order to deal with the economic crisis in that country, he's slashing some of these civil servants. He's privatizing these entities that have not been working for so long. He's removing a lot of subsidies and controls in the economy. And that creates often short-term, quite intense disruption. But these are necessary correctives in order to right-size the economy. So I think we need to learn some of those lessons. And I think one of the big problems in South Africa's political culture is we sort of have this deep desire for consensus, that we need everybody to be united and on the same page. And I can understand that because we come from this very deeply divided past with different communities and interest groups. And there's something quite tempting about sort of like this overarching national agenda. But there's always somebody who sets that agenda. And for a very long time, the ANC has set that agenda. And that's led to some quite calamitous consequences. So, I think one of the concerns is that maybe all the parties are participating in the GNU and joining it out of this sense of a kind of national duty, but they're not fighting hard enough within that to say, okay, well, actually, we need to challenge some of these kind of policy holy cows that have been in place for a long time. And certainly there are colleagues, they have to pick their battles, but sometimes you have to go to war. And I think that's going to be very interesting to observe what are going to be those conflict points.
Right. And I think the worry that some people have expressed of opposition capture is there is a seed of validity in it. I mean, it's early days. I don't think a few months is nearly enough to really expect the government to turn, or the GNU to turn everything around. But I think, for example, your colleague Martin van Staden, who says that he's withholding his strong opinion, or a strong opinion on the performance of the GNU until or withholding the use of the word rebuilding or re-energizing until he sees some actual real policy reforms. And I actually have to say I completely agree with him on that. But the make or break policies are going to be policies. All the 3 and 4 letter acronym policies, the NHI, National Health Insurance, which for those that don't know, which seeks to completely destroy the private private health insurance industry and nationalize all health basically under the state. Black economic empowerment, or racially discriminatory policies, let's call it what it is. Bella, the Bella Act, which seeks to centralize control over schools under the Department of Education, stripping parent councils or boards of their power to determine things like, for example, standards for entry into a school or the language policy of a school. And then naturally expropriation without compensation, EWC, which is the destruction of private property rights in South Africa. These will be the testing, the red lines on which will test the mettle of the GNU. And we'll see whether the GNU is going to opt for letting these bills go through, or these bills become law for the sake of the vibes, or for maybe a few percentage points of GDP increase, or whether in the short term, based on those vibes, or whether they are actually going, or whether the parties within it that don't agree with these radical policies are actually going to put their foot down and treat a red line like a red line, in the way that a red line kind of stipulates by definition, which is until here and no further. But I mean, on that point, particularly, let's say hypothetically that the GNU does not deliver on what it has promised, it does not deliver this radical change. Let's say in another 3 months, nothing has changed, or even let's say a year or 2 years later, there's still either things have not really progressed, or things have gone backwards, or radical policies have been pushed through. In that case, when the GNU hypothetically has failed, what is then to do about bringing about change? On the one side, you could have bet all your money, metaphorically speaking, on this horse, on the GNU horse. But what happens when it loses in the race? I mean, that's game over for you. That's the end. And that's why I think from my side, I always advocate that people need to diversify their change portfolio. They need to always be looking at alternative avenues to bring about change. You can't just depend on elections. You can't just wait every 4 or 5 years for quote unquote change to happen. And then when those elections don't go your way, you just wait another 4 or 5 years and then you quote unquote vote harder. You have to actually have an alternative and other ways to bring about change. And there's many of these ways that I've discussed in detail on this channel. But I think that's the key thing to keep in mind, is that it's definitely much too early to say whether the GNU is going to be a success or not. But I would be highly cautious on betting all my money on it, on putting all my eggs in that basket. I don't think that would be very wise. You need a plan B, not even just a plan B, a plan C and D when it comes to bringing about change. And luckily, both you and me are within the industry where we are thinking about plan B, C, and D.
Yeah, look, I think that kind of diversification strategy is very, very important. And I think also hoping that politicians will necessarily have your best interests at heart is not always a good strategy. I think you should certainly still put pressure on politicians, engage with them. In the FMF itself, we still do submissions to Parliament. We still will meet with policymakers. But ultimately, what you do need to do is build power outside of the state. And especially, you should always think about how do you want political institutions to be structured, or your legal system to be structured. You want to imagine that your worst enemy comes into power tomorrow, and can you withstand the effects of that? And I think, building community structures, I think whether that's business associations, neighborhood watches, private security initiatives, but also other areas of sharing knowledge, sharing expertise, I think is really important. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg, in an old heritage home, which happens to be our offices in Parktown. And I think anyone who lives in Joburg will tell you that the city has experienced significant decline over the last few years. Infrastructure is collapsing. There's litter overflowing in the streets and effluent running down the road. So, yeah, it's definitely seen better days. And we've had this revolving door of mayors coming and going over the last few years. And the latest mayor explicitly said that, and this is on record in News 24, he said, the northern and western suburbs of Joburg are fine. I'm going to follow my constituents, and I'm going to do what's in their best interests. And I appreciate his honesty, actually, because but then I would also say to those residents of the north and the west, well, if your mayor doesn't have your interests at heart, then you should start to assert your own interests. And we are seeing various groups starting to emerge now, like Josie My Josie. I think it's called the Johannesburg Crisis Committee. So where there are problems, people need to start to seek their own solutions. Because like I say, politicians are often motivated by their own very different set of incentives. And I think this sort of goes back to the importance of liberty. I mean, what is the role of the state? It's to ensure the protection of life, liberty, and property. That is a very narrow conception. But my worry is that in South Africa, we've ceded so much power to the state over the years. We've given the state permission to interfere in our daily lives. When you look at core industries like the mining industry, that's ultimately been white-anted away by granting the state control over mineral resources and the issuance of mining licenses and all these other conditions, BE conditions, and other social investment obligations. And now we sit in a situation where the mining industry is basically on its knees and no longer competitive globally, ranking very low down on the Fraser Index of mining competitiveness. So that's a cautionary tale. It's one example of how the state has gradually acquired more and more power. And this balance of forces theme that you raise, I think, is very important. You actually need to offer resistance, and that's not just being obstructionist or difficult or oppositional for its own sake. It's about preserving order, preserving freedom in this country, and preserving the way of life for people who live here. And I think that that's a very important cause.
I actually want to use this, we're just over halfway now, and I want to use this opportunity to give the live chat some attention. We've actually have a lot of live viewers here. I'm very glad to see that. Dagbreker says, Goeienaand, Erns and David. Goeienaand, Kletskolom. They're beautiful Afrikaans. Peter Swart says, do we run a risk of having the ANC recover in support due to what may be achieved by the GNU success? I'll get back to that question now. I'd love to hear David's thoughts there. I'm going to leave all the questions here until I've read all just the comments in general. I have marked some of your questions, so thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. Sideliner opinion says civil society becomes the collective voice of the unrepresented in politics. RJ says, hey, hi everyone in the chat. Take a moment to hit like. It helps the algorithm to share positive ideas. Thank you very much, RJ. Peter Swart says, if we can't find politicians that think and act like an AfriForum or Solidariteit, we will struggle to see real improvement. Career politicians are not ideal candidates. And then we also like RJ says, like the stream, everyone. Thank you very much, RJ. Really appreciate it. Greiling Moelman says, net betyds vir die regstreeks. Baie lekker om jou hier te sien, Greiling. Jy is ook 'n gereelde luisteraar daar op Politiek. RJ says, admittedly, I am a David Ansara fanboy. So that's nice to see that you were able to make this live. And RJ also says the thumbnail is brilliant and true. Well, thank you very much, RJ. Yeah. For those that didn't see it or those that are listening on a podcast platform, it's basically just a dam with all the civil society organizations forming the wall, and the water that it's holding in is all these destructive policies that are threatening to destroy a lot in South Africa. Now, to get to the questions, David, I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of them. I'm going to give you the opportunity to give your thoughts on this one first, and I'll answer from my side as well. It's the question from Peter Swart, who says, do we run a risk of having the ANC recover in support due to what may be achieved by the GNU success? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Gee, that's a hard question to answer from Peter. I mean, I don't want to speculate. I would say that the Social Research Foundation released data which showed an uptick in ANC support to about 45%, but also interestingly, the DA support went up to about 25%. So, I think, yeah, sure. I mean, it could also be the case that you now have internal competition within the cabinet, and ANC cabinet ministers not wanting to be shown up by some of the other parties in the cabinet. So that could lead to people lifting their game. But, I think broadly speaking, I think this is mostly a good thing. I think the era of single party dominance is over. I think you are also seeing fragmentation and strain within the tripartite alliance, for example. Not all of them are happy with the GNU.
Sorry to interrupt you, David. Just could you quickly give an idea for our international audience what the tripartite alliance is? You don't even have to give an entire thesis. Just quickly, who are the members there and what do they represent?
Okay, so the three main members is the African National Congress, the political party, the South African Communist Party, which does not contest elections, but which has historically had a very strong ideological influence over the ANC, and many joint members, many SSCP members in
Former
cabinet.
finance minister.
Yes, yeah. So, and that's not kind of like Reds under the bed fear-mongering. It's very explicit. There's regular summits between these three entities. And then the third is COSATU, which is a trade union federation, which was established in the 1980s, 1983, I think, which is a confederation of different trade unions. Historically, a lot of industrial unions were part of COSATU, the National Union of Mine Workers and Metal Workers and so on. But as South Africa's economy is deindustrialized, we've also seen the shrinking of the membership of those industrial unions, also some fragmentation as well. So now a lot of the members of COSATU are actually civil servants. So they work for the state, and they have an interest in maintaining this vast bureaucracy that characterizes the South African government. And just to give you an idea of the scale, in South Africa, we have roughly about 16 or 17 million people in formal employment, and about 2 million people work for the government in some capacity, including state-owned enterprises. So that's about 1/8 of anyone who has a job in South Africa is working for the government. And so there is almost a conflict of interest there. These entities, they want to maintain this very large state. They want to capture the levers of power in the state. That's why we've often argued that state capture is a feature, not a bug, of ANC governance. But look, I think we also need to update that model a bit. I think there's a lot of internal conflict that's happening within the tripartite alliance. And, we spoke about winners and losers earlier. Some people are feeling like that's a threat to their interests. So I think that's potentially an interesting trend. And some analysts have asked whether the tripartite alliance can stick together. I've been studying South African politics for a number of years now, and every year some analyst predicts the end of the tripartite alliance, but I haven't yet seen it. So, but I guess anything's possible.
I think it is important to always, when one of my guests or myself, when we reference the tripartite alliance, I think it's so important just to repeat again what it is, because it tells you so much about what the structure or the power of government, who was in power in the South African government for the past 30 years. It's the trade unions, it's the South African Communist Party, and it's the ANC, which have had the major impact on shaping South Africa for the past 30 years, shaping policy. And as you correctly stated, it's not just the Red Scare, Reds under the bed. It's actually, the ANC are sourcing governmental ministers from the South African Communist Party. They are doing speeches at the South African Communist Party events, and they can be pressured, or to a lesser extent now, I think in 2024, it seems like the South African Communist Party has lost some sway within the tripartite alliance. But over the years, they've had a massive influence on the ANC. They could actually threaten the ANC, and the ANC would take it seriously. And as I said, even going as far as appointing a minister of finance from the South African Communist Party ranks. There was another comment here from Gert Jansen van Rensburg, who said, I am worried that there are no parties in the GNU who has a backbone or a policy that they are prepared to die on. They just want to get along just to get along. Well, that's what we talked about earlier, where the big risk is sacrificing everything for the vibes, sacrificing everything to retain harmony. That's a genuine risk, Gert. And then here's a question here that I'm going to answer first. And then, David, if you have any other thoughts as well, you can add. RJ asks, Conscious Caracal, what is the role of driving and controlling the narrative have in coalition politics? Well, that's the Overton window, firstly. It's what type of policy suggestions are acceptable and which are not. If, for example, organizations like AfriForum and the Free Market Foundation and Sakeliga and OUTA aren't pushing for policies that we would like to see, policies that go against, for example, the National Democratic Revolution, or policies that organizations like the South African Communist Party might not support. If we don't push for those types of policies and make strong arguments on why those policies need to be enacted, then you pretty much leave the whole conversation about the policy direction of government. You just cede it to the left and the far left, and then you pretty much are left with policies that can't go outside of that Overton window. The Overton window shifts completely, jerks completely to the left, and that's where taking part in the bigger debate and influencing the narrative also has an influence. As I said, and I keep repeating this because it's so important, it's not just good enough to push ideas. It's not just good enough to discuss ideas. You should actually also be building up your influence and your power to be able to influence the balance of forces. But at the same time, you should also be explaining very clearly and concisely why your ideas are the ones that should be followed, and also dismantling the destructive policies and ideas that are leading South Africa or your country down a destructive path. So it's a two-pronged approach that's important. On the one side, you have the battle of ideas, which is important, and you should not retreat from it, because then you just cede it. You just give complete monopoly on that realm to the left and the far left, and to the radicals and extremists. And then also on this other side, just as you should take part in the battle of ideas in the larger conversation, you should also be building up your parallel power, building up your influence to be able to actually have de facto influence on reality, not just talking about ideas constantly. And we were talking about this off air, David, is where I think it's more important than ever to be building state-proof solutions, to be building alternatives and parallel institutions and parallel sources of power outside of the government sphere. And I mean, I think we're in total agreement there, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, particularly on elaborating on why that's so important now.
Yeah, look, I think as we were saying earlier, it's a risk mitigation strategy. I think South Africa came within a hair's whisker of having an EFF coalition government with the ANC. And, Bill Clinton often said politics is always about compared to what. So I suppose we might have our misgivings about the GNU, but I think on balance, things would have been quite a lot worse with an EFF partner in government. And I think that's sort of one of the tricky situations, is that the DA and other partners, they might have their conditions and their red lines, but they've said very explicitly, we did this to keep the EFF and Mkhonto weSizwe, MK, Jacob Zuma's party, out of power. And so whenever you threaten to leave the coalition, then you're sort of in this awkward bind, because now, but you said that you weren't prepared to throw South Africa into the arms of EFF and MK. So now, surely you should just play nice with the NHI or the Bella Bill or whatever the case might be. So yeah, but as we've seen in places like Tshwane, right, these coalitions can unravel very, very rapidly as interests shift. And for a long time, Action SA was quite content to prop up the DA mayor in Tshwane, and its interests changed, and the consequences for residents of Tshwane were quite negative by the looks of it. But they're just bystanders in this process, just as we here in Johannesburg are bystanders with all the goings on there. And so, yeah, that spectacle of politics is very interesting. But meanwhile, your community, your neighborhood is falling apart, and people need to step in and solve those problems. And ultimately, it's people that solve problems, not governments. So yeah, it's a difficult message, because I mean, as free marketeers, we believe in division of labor and specialization. You want people to be able to focus on their core activities and know that somebody's taking care of refuse removal and another person's taking care of electricity reticulation. But when those systems break down because of political interference or corruption or whatever the case may be, you can't just stand idly by and let that happen, right? And I think very importantly as well is, we are proponents of individual freedom, but individuals can achieve great things through voluntary cooperation and collaboration with one another. And so actually what we need is scalable solutions to state failure, as Sakilicha has proposed. So if you think of electricity, for example, having a solar panel on your roof, that's a very good mitigator against the dysfunctionality of Eskom or your municipality's electricity distribution system. But that's a small modular solution, right? What we need is large private producers of electricity selling electricity and distributing it at scale to meet our industrial needs, to meet the needs of whole communities, right? And there's nothing to say that the production and distribution of energy shouldn't be wholly privatized. It's not, this is something that's been around since the late 19th century. It's not rocket science. And it's not necessary that the government has to have exclusive control over this function. We've actually ceded that function. If you look at kind of the early 20th century, electricity production was not a state function. It was sort of nationalized in the mid 20th century. And yeah, I mean, some analysts have pointed out, load shedding has been fixed, and we've refurbished the coal power stations, and that's great. It's nice to have electricity, but ultimately the core underlying problems there I don't think have been resolved, and there's a lot of inefficiencies in that system, and consumers are now dealing with tariff rate increases in the kind of north of 30%. And so a market-based alternative to that would be much more efficient, much more consumer-focused. So yeah, that's the other part of the conversation is privatization. I think privatization is really important for deleveraging some of those risks of state dependency. And it's not just about making money; it's actually about providing those scalable solutions that we were speaking about.
Yeah, no, just one little point there on the rolling blackouts that have abated for a few months. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that load shedding has often been solved just for it to come back. And I mean, people forget the fact, or maybe the government just doesn't want to mention the fact that in the past 2 years, private South Africans have pretty much built the equivalent of 2 coal power stations in regards to the amount of solar panels that they've put on their rooftops. So that's 2 new coal power stations that the government, as if the government had built 2 new coal power stations just in rooftop solar alone that private individuals have put on their houses and on their businesses. So that's having a major alleviating effect on the pressures on the system. And there's many other factors as well that are going on. I see there was a comment here from Helen who said, Helen Duplessis says, so nice seeing AfriForum jumping in and fixing things here in Pretoria. Well, Helen, we said this week as well that AfriForum will continue to serve the communities of Pretoria, whether the Metro helps us or wants to support us or not. That's not going to stop us. Luckily, we're not an organization that needs the government's permission to improve our communities, but support from the Metro and good cooperation with the Metro is always welcome. That's not something that we're going to say is not that does not have an effect. I would always prefer good cooperation between community-based organizations and the metros and the municipalities rather than a antagonistic relationship there or an obstacle-ridden relationship there. But we'll see what the future holds. But what we're doing, we're not going to be stopping. We might just have a bit more of a cold shoulder from the municipality going forward, but we'll see. So, David, I wanted to also, as we start nearing the end here, I wanted to ask you a bit about your organization's projects that are on the horizon. One of them is not a new project. It is a project that you've been doing now for a while, and that's the Rule of Law project there at the Free Market Foundation. Give the audience that might not know a little bit of a summary or an idea of what that entails.
Yeah, I mean, some people might think that the rule of law is a bit of a tangent to the work that we do, but actually it's really integral for preserving freedom in society. That the rule of law can be best understood as the opposite of rule by man. And that's that the laws and the rules in a society apply equally to everyone. That is, that when decisions are made by governments, that they are rooted in law rather than just the discretion of whoever happens to be in power. And I think South Africans tend to maybe forget that principle, that when you elect somebody into government, they're not in charge of the country. They are there with a very specific mandate, and they're bound by the Constitution and by the common law and by other rules and regulations that exist before them. So, and I think that's very important for acting as a check on the abuse of power and also preserving and upholding the rights of individuals. And so the primary way that this plays out is in public interest litigation. So we, as the Rule of Law Project, as this initiative, we have a team of attorneys, advocates, legal scholars who sit on this committee. So it's not only FMF people, also outsiders who advise us on issues pertaining to where the rule of law may be in breach, or where there's a particular case which we might want to participate in. So we're always on the lookout for strategic litigation where we can uphold and defend the rule of law. And, I mentioned some of our previous cases. So we intervened as a friend of the court in a case between Sakelige and the Communist Minister of Finance that you mentioned earlier. And that was around preferential procurement. And essentially, Sakelige's objection was that the Minister of Finance was imposing pre-qualification criteria on any entity that was looking to do business with the state. So you had to be a 100% Black-owned firm, even to be considered for a state contract. And so, if you were 75% Black-owned, then you could get stuffed. So and this locked out many, many private enterprises that could be offering good value, low cost, and effective services to the state, which would benefit people who receive state services. And so this was an important case. And the Rule of Law Project actually intervened. And our argument was that the finance minister was imposing these rules across spheres of government, which was in violation of the doctrine of the separation of powers, that he was, as a national minister, imposing these rules on provinces, on municipalities, and on state-owned enterprises. And actually, the Constitutional Court, in their judgment, sided with our argument. So that was a very important intervention there. So it's a bit technical, but I think it shows that, as you were saying, it's very important to engage in the battle of ideas, to be writing in the media, to be doing interviews like this and so on. But you also need to be exercising your power as well. And the courts are a very important arena for contestation as well. So that's the Rule of Law Project. We're also involved in the Julius Malema and AfriForum hate speech case. We were friends of the court there, also arguing that Pepuda and the other kind of hate speech laws have been unevenly applied in South Africa, and that there's a lot of preferential treatment for politically powerful individuals. So that theme of equal application of the law, equality before the law, independence of the courts, depoliticization of the judiciary, these are very important principles to preserve freedom and equality before the law in South Africa.
Right. And David, my last question to you is just the question that I ask all my guests at the end. And that is, if you could leave the audience with something to chew on, an idea or a question or anything, doesn't have to be a massive thesis or hypothesis. What would you encourage them to think about a little bit in the week ahead? It can be an idea or just something that's been on your mind recently. Any such suggestions, if you could plant it at the back of their mind this week?
I guess I would say that liberty lies in the hearts and minds of men and women. It doesn't reside in courts or in parliaments or in government departments. If you value your freedom, if you want to live in a society where everybody has opportunities, everybody is able to be self-directed in their lives, whether it's the career that they choose or the ideas that they hold dear, you need to make that happen. You need to fight for it. And people have different means, different capabilities of engaging in that. But I would say that if you cherish your freedom and your independence, you need to stand up for it. And what I do find is that a lot of people maybe fear how others might perceive them. They don't want to get involved in a big fight or a conflict. But courage is contagious. And if you stand up for the ideas that you believe in, then you'll be surprised who you attract. And it might make for a more interesting life, but also a purposeful one. And yeah, so I think it's important to pursue your career, to look out for the interests of your family and yourself, but ultimately you need to also find that higher good that you're wanting to fight for. So yeah, I think that's my parting words.
Fantastic. And then just the administrative question: if people like your ideas or want to learn more, where can they find your ideas or some of your writing, or where can they just find more David Ansara?
Yeah, so I would point them to the Free Market Foundation website, and yeah, our various social media channels. We're on X, we're on YouTube. I'd really appreciate some likes and subscribes on our YouTube channel. Got a lot of interesting content there at the moment. But yeah, and then also we didn't get to talk about it too much, but we've just launched a new policy agenda for this 7th parliamentary term. So although we can be a critical bunch sometimes, we've also got some really interesting and tangible policy proposals that we're putting forward to policymakers and politicians to really unlock economic freedom in South Africa. So we're in the midst of, we did our first launch today, and we're also doing over the next 4 weeks a series of papers and media launches around those key themes. It's called Liberty First. So you can visit libertyfirst.co.za to check that out. So that's some of our current work.
And yeah, for those that are too lazy to go type, there is links to all of that in the description of the stream, to the YouTube channel, to David's X, and also to the Free Market Foundation website. I see a sideliner opinion says, thank you, David and Adams, for a very civil and informative discussion without any hidden agendas. You are clearly not in politics. And then Dagbreker says, uitstekende gesprek, Adams en David, baie insiggewend, kom kuier maar gerus vir nog 'n koffietjie. Thank you very much, Sideliner, and also baie dankie, Dagbreker. And yeah, David, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your insights and coming here to share some of them here with us tonight. I mean, no, it's a big challenge to set out an entire hour on a weekday evening to discuss big ideas and to do long form discussion, but it's necessary. And these types of shows, they, I think, incrementally have an effect. If enough people are having these conversations, it will have an impact. But as I said, the battle of ideas is not primary. It's merely one of the battlefields out there. And yeah, to all of everyone in the audience as well, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for there was many comments and many questions, a lot of questions this stream as well. Thank you very much for those. Really appreciate it. And if you're new to this channel and you like these types of conversations, you can subscribe. You can also leave a like. And if you're watching and it's no longer live, you can still take part in the conversation and ask questions in the comment section. I read all of them, and I really enjoy reading what you guys have to say. And it seems that everyone really enjoyed this conversation as well. Nothing but kind words in the live chat there. David, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your evening and rest of your week. And yeah, we'll chat again somewhere in the near future, hopefully in person.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thanks very much, Anson. Thanks to everyone for tuning in and for the great comments.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless. Goodbye.